Hey there, I made a pilot and I'm gonna talk about it. First of all, I just want to reiterate that I'm super blown away by the response. I know I've said it a lot, but it really is true. You know, I've been a Transformers fan for a very long time, and in the back of my head, I've had an idea for something I thought would be really cool, and one day I was just like, fuck it, I guess I'm gonna make it. I'm a storyboard artist professionally, and I've been getting comfortable with Storyboard Pro, pushing the limits for what you can do in the program, and it just struck me that this could be my way of seeing what was possible if I just committed to making a project entirely on my own. I really was not expecting that many people to even see it, and the reaction has been honestly kind of overwhelming. This video isn't really something I imagined I'd be making, but so many people have had questions and want to know more, so I figured I'd just talk about it. I'm going to try to structure this as a general behind-the-scenes project tour with Q&A stuff sprinkled in between. Hopefully I'll get a good mix of production and lore-related stuff. Alright, are we ready? Let's start. So I started designing takes on Transformers characters years and years ago. This is when I was still in high school, and at that point I wasn't totally sure what kind of art I might want to do, since that's around when I first started seriously considering that as a career. At that point I still thought I might want to do character design or viz dev, so this was a little bit of practice for that. Optimus, Megatron, and Starscream were some of my first. I've always preferred the Decepticons, so even back then, the idea of a Decepticon-centered show was on my mind. The actual ideas didn't really crystallize until way later, but, you know, as somebody who finds the unique, feeling of Transformers as a thing interesting, I had at least, an inkling of what this would become for a really long time. Before I get into the cast, I'll take this opportunity to talk about creative license a little bit, since it applies to a lot of things here. You probably noticed that there's a lot of stuff that's different, and that's completely intentional. I'm uninterested in making what I'd call a mathematically perfect fan project, which is something that is aiming to be the definitive Transformers story. I'm not knocking that, everybody has their own definitive thing they like story, but I'm not super interested in it. I'm approaching this from the angle of what if Transformers was something else? Specifically, what if we took this concept and reinterpreted it as an action horror story? Point being, I really want to make it clear that I don't want to approach this or think about this project like a checklist of beats I have to hit. It's more than likely going to be missing something you might like. This is mostly just a creative exercise. Making a quote-unquote good Transformers thing is fifth on my list of priorities. As for characters, of course Starscream is the fan favorite. I really love her. I've always thought Starscream was a really fun archetype, a sort of cunning, charming social engineer who maybe believes her own hype a little bit too much. She's absolutely threatening and competent in her own right, but when you look at her in all these powerful positions and think, wow, she's gotta be super smart to trick everyone around her, maybe it's not so much that she's a super skilled liar and more than she finds people who want to believe her, Kinda like the Faye Valentine of the group. She's got a lot more to her, but she's just a really fun character. Speaking of, I've had people ask what I was inspired by, and I've specifically had people ask if the visual style of ETD was inspired by Cowboy Bebop. I have rewatched Cowboy Bebop for the first time in a while recently, but it actually wasn't on my mind that much. Some of the stuff I really heavily referenced was Ghost in the Shell, Evangelion, obviously, Memories, Vampire Hunter D, Bloodlust, Serial Experiments Lane, and lots of older movies of course, Alien, Event Horizon, The Thing, stuff like that. You'll notice that the spaceship has a very heavy analog feeling, as opposed to the sort of slick, futuristic sci-fi you're probably used to. Space itself is a really big character in the story, and where the alien tech tells you that the robots are unusual and more at home in space, I really wanted to lean into the opposite. Transformers are kind of uncomfortably human, right? As robots, they resemble human-made machines and vehicles, and they're obviously anthropomorphic, but there's something like kind of unnerving about their existence. Even though they're aliens, when we observe them from their perspective, they're in an entirely unfamiliar place. They're away from essentially the only hospitable place for them in the entire universe, using equipment and vessels that are really quite unreliable, and I want that to feel really palpable here. Obviously, I won't spoil all the details since the world building is my favorite part, but personally, I'm really fascinated by the idea that even despite being such engineered machines, they're highly imperfect in the way that all machines are. Instead of a direct transcendence of the organic and physical form, mechanization is just a layer of protection that lacks synchronicity with the identity. Lots of cool stuff there that I'm hoping to expand on. Okay, sorry that was a lot of posturing. Let's talk about Megatron. So I really wanted you to kind of feel Megatron's absence here. She's an immense force, physically and emotionally, and without her the ship feels very empty. Obviously, she takes up significant runtime in the form of her dream. While the dream itself is revealing, it's also supposed to feel kind of ambiguous. You're seeing this manufactured and ultimately symbolic scenario, but there are a lot of cues that tell you this isn't really reality. Some of them are subtle, and some of them definitely aren't. But like, is this pure fantasy, or does it maybe represent some sort of memory? Why is what specifically happens here important? I really liked setting this up, and I kind of feel like I have to hold myself back from revealing the underlying mystery it's attached to. I promise I won't, though. As for Megatron as a character, she's definitely one of, if not the most important. I wanted to portray a Megatron that is clearly powerful and brutal, but it's contrasted by the fact that she is, asleep on her own ship on purpose. Megatron is a character with a lot of conflict, both internal and external, and you might be surprised by how your expectation doesn't really match up with reality. Or maybe it does, I don't know what you're thinking. Maybe you've got me figured out. Now it's time for a question a lot of people have asked. What's up with Megatron and Starscream? Is there something going on here? If you haven't guessed, I'm taking a very different approach to them, and their relationship is an important part of that. Just as an aside, they probably have my favorite chemistry in Transformers, which, is not hard, but still. Like, even in G1, there's this dichotomy between them constantly squabbling, and on the flip side, this sort of trust they have to be scheming with each other. And then just, like, the gun thing. It's such a weirdly fun idea, and at times there's this almost, like, tenderness between them. It's so strange. But a majority of Transformers stuff is really not interested in them and their relationship, and as a result, it's become extremely one-note. Like, okay, Transformers is a huge franchise and not everybody cares. That's fine. But even stuff that's trying to be, like, the nuanced and mature Transformers just kind of repeats essentially the same content, just as gritty set dressing. Like, Starscream getting beaten up by Megatron or the plot is just something that's supposed to happen, and it gets shoehorned in just for the sake of doing it. And as is, their relationship just kind of gets reduced to this very one-note thing. That makes me sad. If I'm already doing something entirely different, why not give you a reason to care about that betrayal, So to answer another question, no, Megatron does not abuse Starscream here. There are lots of reasons. I don't want to add that, really. But the biggest one is just that I don't think it adds any real value, and I don't find it interesting. I want to present their core friction as something more interpersonal than physical, and give you a weighty feeling dynamic without the literal violence. If you just can't enjoy a Transformers thing unless Megatron is beating Starscream up, then that's fine. I don't know why that's your one principle, but, that's fine. You can skip this. This is your warning. I'm not saying my way is inherently better, but I am asking you to wait and see how their relationship develops. I think there's a lot of potential in exploring them as characters. I won't spoil the details, but I think it won't be entirely what you expect in either direction. Speaking of expectations, let's finally move on to our next Decepticon. I have big plans for Soundwave. They've changed probably the most out of any core cast member in terms of appearance, but I think their design is really fun to draw. Soundwave is another character I feel kind of lacks, I'll call it texture in a lot of Transformers stuff. Don't get me wrong, I like Soundwave, but it's definitely one of those characters that feels pretty crystallized, and by consequence doesn't really do that much. Yeah, Soundwave exists in the plot and performs actions, but there isn't much movement as far as character or purpose. If you feel differently, that's fine, but that's kind of the place I approached them from. Instead of being this blanket cool character, Soundwave is a bit closer to how they were described initially. Self-interested and self-important, but also very difficult to like. Even Starscream is personable enough to have fair-weather friends, but Soundwave is a bit hard to get along with, and they're not particularly interested in other people either. I have a lot more in store for Soundwave, but that's another thing you'll have to wait and see for. Honestly, I think their focus episode is my favorite, but that's a little ways off. Lockdown is next. This is one of my favorite initial wave designs. It's a little noisy, but I really like his shape and his look. Another question I've gotten that I can answer here is, what's Lockdown doing on this ship? So, Lockdown used to be a bounty hunter, but when the Civil War really ramped up, he became a medic as a way to kind of get himself out of trouble. He's made a lot of enemies on both sides of the war, and now that things have escalated to a point of, hopelessness, this is his way to guarantee a form of protection and to hide out. I really wanted to make him seem kind of unassuming here. I mean, he's taken on Knockout as a protege, which, it seems like a pretty selfless thing to do. But that's not the whole story. Really, he's a bit of a wild card. Sure, right now, when they're all isolated and drifting through space, he's playing nice, but, he's a little bit scary looking, right? I'm very excited to do more with him. There's a bit more to establish before he becomes a key player, but, everybody here has an important story, I think. Next up is Knockout. Of course. I had a few people asking who this is, and here's your answer. I wanted him to look a little out of place with the rest of the cast, because he really is. He's a former Autobot who defected right around when conditions got dire, and he's very out of sync with all the others, physically and emotionally. He's a lot younger than you might be used to, and while he definitely has a bad attitude right at home with the rest of them, he doesn't quite seem to know what he's doing here. Like Lockdown, being a medic is just kind of the safest, most logical thing he can do right now. Here's another related question that I'm excited about. Are the Transformers techno-organic? The answer is yes. Once again, I'll try to avoid spoiling all the fun lore, but think of them as these kind of coral-like creatures that were slowly mechanized over time. Eventually, this sort of cyborg operation just became a thing every Cybertronian did, and the cyberized shell they're compatible with determined their social and economic caste on Cybertron. The resulting organisms are mostly robotic shells with organic components inside of them, like machines with a few meat parts. There's a lot more really fun stuff I can't wait to get into, but this video is already going to be too long. You're just gonna need to wait and see. Ravage is probably my least favorite character, but a lot of you really seem to like him. He's just weird. So you might have noticed there's another cassette that appears in the pilot. I'll give you a few seconds to guess who that is. Do you have a guess? Yep, it's Laserbeak, right in the server room section. Laserbeak is essentially Soundwave's pet, and she's not a fully sentient Cybertronian. She's just a very intelligent creature that was mechanized in the same way. Ravage, on the other hand, is not an animal. He's a full-blooded Cybertronian. He's just a mini-con with an animal-looking shell. When I first introduced and explained Ravage, I remember getting a lot of people going, "Oh, so he's like a furry, and the cat thing is his fursona." And my reaction to that was, oh yeah, that actually makes perfect sense. I honestly didn't even consider that when I came up with the idea. I was completely content to say Ravage is just really weird, and nobody really wants to think about why he's committed to the permanent cat LARPing, but the fursona thing is a lot cuter, actually. Because he's a mini-con, you might have guessed that he's not one of Soundwave's cassettes anymore. He's a sovereign individual. You might have also noticed on Megatron's render that the fusion cannon looks a little different. Tiny spoiler, but that's because Ravage is the cannon. Surprise! I'll save the details on what happened to Megatron's classic fusion cannon for later, but this weapon utility is Ravage's bargaining chip for shelter and safety here. This stage of the war, you need a really good reason to leech off of someone's warship and eat their energon, so that's kind of how Ravage gets by. He's not a very big fan of it, and Megatron isn't super thrilled either, so not an ideal situation for anyone. But that's all the Decepticons for now. There are more characters that will become important later, but for the time being, this is our core cast. While I had the ensemble decided pretty early on in conceptualizing this project, there are some other important Decepticons I had to decide when to introduce, and even just opening with Megatron in stasis was a way to give you time to get acquainted with everyone. I wanted to give the sense that none of these characters are each other's first choice of companion, and even when Megatron gets added to the picture, there's this fundamental disconnect. This is just sort of the team she ends up with, and whether or not she can keep this operation together really speaks to the state of the whole movement. That's the real core conflict I want to communicate here, before any of the literal political conflict. Now let's talk about the fun part, production. So, I initially wrote the script for this episode about a year ago. It wasn't my first time writing a script for a project like this, but it's also not something I do very often, so it was definitely a challenge. I'm a pretty amateur writer, so my earliest draft was much more dialogue heavy, and a lot of my initial revisions were just finding as many places I could cut as possible. For example, the scene where Starscream talks to Megatron on the pod was initially a lot longer. In the first draft of the script, that scene was also the opening scene, and the fight would have been back-to-back with the second half of the dream sequence. Unfortunately, after recording that first draft of the monologue, I just thought, man, this is going to be so boring. I cut a bunch of stuff from the opening monologue, but eventually I realized the fight sequence was probably just the most interesting part, the most technically impressive at least, and it'd make sense to lead with that. I didn't really have the confidence in the monologue to hold attention, so having something to hook you just really made sense to me. Honestly, that monologue was changing up until the last few weeks of working, and there's a lot of dialogue that got swapped, added, or even just cut entirely. Just about every single scene was massively trimmed because my original script was just too long and too meandering. What are you gonna do? Maybe I was too unconfident in my writing, but I think cutting content gave the whole thing a much more mysterious feel. It forced me to rely a lot more on mood-setting direction and acting to imply what was really going on. You know, instead of Starscream just telling you how long Megatron has been asleep and how she feels about it, mostly just for the audience's benefit, she's talking to Megatron. And if we really pay attention to what she's saying and doing, it gives the sense of what her core conflicts are, and not just the literal situation she's describing. I'm sure there are some places where I was a bit too unsubtle, or on the other hand, too vague with stuff like that. But in general, I tried to make up for my inefficiency in writing by replacing some of the less effective dialogue with stuff that can really only be tied down in the boarding and direction. I think that's actually one of the most important things this project taught me. It really showed me where careful, understated direction can carry a piece, and that the actual skill in storyboarding is about way more than just a drawing. I feel like I've learned a lot about how to approach direction going forward, and I can already see points in this project that I could have improved and approached differently. Another scene that had a lot of cut content was that fight scene. You probably won't be surprised to hear that that sequence took up the lion's share of the time and energy for the whole project, especially since I was basically just working on this over weekends. The orbital shot in the middle that's 20 seconds long was literally days and days of work alone, and I spent even more time fiddling with it after the actual drawing was done. Action sequences are my favorite thing to board, and I think they're most people's favorites. But honestly, writing an action scene is kinda hard. That's something I really took for granted when I was planning this whole thing out. When you're working with someone else's scripts or concepts, you're sort of given the skeleton of a scene, and your job is to connect them all and make a sequence that not only gets from point A to point B, but uses the entire setting to do it. I feel like it's a lot easier to get presented with characters and settings other people have already basically figured out, and then construct dynamic action around those limitations, instead of building that framework yourself. Looking back at it now, there's a lot I would have changed about the whole sequence. I honestly thought about cutting that aforementioned long orbital shot a few times, but it had a lot of important action in it that I didn't really want to reboard and recut, even if it probably would have taken less time than the original sequence did. I wanted the dream arena to feel kind of unreal and strange, but in the end I feel like the setting just didn't feel very dynamic, and it resulted in characters behaving in a way that felt staged. Maybe that helps with the dream feeling, but it did teach me a lot about the bones of a good action, and planning sequences like this on a deeper level. There's still a lot to improve, but I think this was definitely a valuable exercise. Speaking of, Megatron's monologue is another one that got trimmed down, and I think it really ended up better for it. As far as the sequence goes, there are some mild continuity errors that are going to bug me forever, but emotionally, I think it works. That was a pretty difficult scene to communicate the emotion for, especially since there's an added layer of complexity with the detail that this is a literal fabrication. I was worried people were going to come away from this not understanding the dream sequence at all, but as far as I'm aware, I haven't had anyone say they were completely lost. Making stuff coherent without overwriting is actually really hard, and I'm glad that the only continuity things I've had people ask questions about are the deliberate decisions, like, underlying mysteries and all that. Now let's talk about something that people really will not stop asking me about. The voice acting. So I made this project with two major goals. First, as I mentioned, to develop my skills by seeing how far I could take a solo project and work with the concept. Starting with an existing idea and interpreting it in a wildly different direction is a really fun way to challenge yourself. The second goal I had in mind was to see what I could make entirely on my own by spending as little money as possible. Besides commissioning the songs, some sound effect packs I have for general use, and paying for my Storyboard Pro subscription, I did not spend any money on this. I made this entirely on my own, with stuff I already have. The voice acting is all done by me because it was free and it helped me establish things like timing and direction. Like I said, I was not expecting that many people to see this, and I think a lot of you might have come away not really understanding the purpose of scratch audio, and that's definitely my fault. I tried to clean it up and make it listenable, at least, but I'm really not a voice actor, and I did this entirely because it is really easy to hit myself up when I need to record a new take or add a new line. I think the fact that some of the characters use different pronouns than you might be used to led to a lot of people thinking this was a deliberate creative decision, and I'm sorry to say that no, not all of them are intended to be women. If you want to interpret them that way, then you are absolutely welcome to, but that was not my intention for everybody. I'm sorry. Honestly, this might be surprising to hear, but Starscream was the worst character to voice. I hated doing that voice. None of the voices are representative of exactly how I intended them to sound, because again, ideally I'd have real voice actors. But Starscream's ideal voice is much higher and more emotive than mine. I'm like an alto butch. It is hard to do a quote-unquote not annoying voice. Considering that I have had a lot, and I mean a lot, of people ask me about voice acting, and volunteering, and hitting me up, and asking me about it, and I truly am really grateful. Like, I really appreciate it. It's really humbling that enough people are interested in this project to want to contribute, but the critical thing stopping me from relying on volunteers is that I really don't want to be taking free work for this. A big part of me doing this on my own is that stuff changes a lot in production, and I'm the only person who has to retake lines or cut content or stuff like that. I'm pretty particular about stuff like the direction, and I really wouldn't be comfortable accepting free work with that pipeline. If you really want to volunteer your voice, I have no problems with people doing their own fan dubs or using this project to practice. Please feel free. I really don't feel comfortable accepting free work from strangers, though. If I had the means to pay, maybe, but that's all stuff for the what comes next segment. Here's another question I got a few times. What was my favorite scene to work on? Honestly, I feel like the relative fun level for individual scenes varied pretty heavily depending on the day and the progress. Like, starting a sequence is unilaterally more fun than finishing it. But if I had to pick a favorite, I'd honestly say it's probably the sequence with Lockdown and Knockout, which might just be because it was the shortest. Still, there were some fun bits of animation that I enjoyed, and I think this is where my level of detail for the low movement scenes really crystallized. There's still some stuff about it that bothers me, but because it was so short, there's less of that regret to go around, which kinda, makes it the de facto favorite. Oh, also, I think the scene had a lot of my favorite world building in it. A lot of people commented about the organ and the techno-organic thing, which I already mentioned earlier. Maybe a fun filler video idea would be like a bit of background explanation of the biology, since I have a pretty involved idea for how it all works, and that would be something fun to demonstrate visually. Here's another one. What's your favorite cut content? That's kind of hard to say. A lot of the cut content was just necessary pruning things down, and I wouldn't have cut it if I had some sort of attachment, Moreover, in the batch of episodes surrounding this one, I think this was the most concrete as far as the sequence of events goes. Like, besides the one scene moving places, the actual things that happened were pretty set in stone early on. I guess maybe some of the Starscream and Soundwave banter that got cut is my favorite. There was some stuff in there that would have given you a bit more context, but I did struggle to prune that sequence because the dry, rambling feeling was what I was going for. The opposite question, though, is something I can answer. My least favorite scene that didn't get cut is the second half of the dream sequence. I was thinking of scrapping everything after Orion rips off his jaw up until probably the day I exported everything. And I'm really surprised that a lot of people said they liked this scene specifically. The only reason it's still in is because when I was trying to decide what to do, I had no idea what to replace it with, and I really didn't want to spend another month or so completely redoing that entire sequence to work. Maybe I am just allergic to sincerity or tenderness, but I was just not happy with that thing. It sets up some important thematic material with content that would be expanded on later, but thinking about this as a pilot that could hypothetically stand on its own, and might be the only thing people ever see of my work, it just felt weightless to me. Like, without the later context, I was really afraid that it would just suck all the intrigue out of the whole thing. In my head, the closest analog I can think of is the opening of the first episode of Cowboy Bebop. It's a moody, mysterious sequence that you can still extract information from. It tells you something about Spike that heavily informs how you view him and understand his priorities, but it also doesn't say anything directly. It gives you a lot to work with out of basically nothing. I wanted Megatron's dream to be ambiguous like that, to make you view the character in a light that feels intriguingly separate from the rest of the dream sequence and makes you question exactly what you saw, and puts a bit of a twist on not just Megatron's actions, but the entire sequence of events on the warship. I wanted to do all that, and I just couldn't figure out how to write and perform that dialogue in a way that felt correct. Look at me, I downplayed Cowboy Bebop earlier, now I'm referencing it here. I'm keeping in mind, as I'm saying this, the audience of people watching is never going to know exactly how the finished product differs from my intent. You're only ever going to know the finished product through the compromises I had to make and my own limitations. I'm pleasantly surprised that so many people responded positively to that scene, and maybe I just don't know what I'm talking about. I mean, in my head, I kinda genuinely thought that I would have people watch it and go, I was going to give this like an 8 out of 10, but then that last scene killed it, and now it's like a 3. I really did think that would be like the universal consensus. But clearly it's not, and I'm glad people like it. I promise the stuff it's hypothetically leading up to is a lot cooler and more fun, at least to me. But maybe my creative sense is just screwed up. I mean, maybe I'm gonna make an episode I think is better and you guys all hate it. Before I wrap this section, one last production thing I wanted to mention is the Optimus gore. This is actually something I also thought people were going to hate. The The point of the dream is to feel mean-spirited because, the fact that Megatron won in the dream was pretty unremarkable. I mean, Transformers shows have done basically the same thing in the past, but the visuals are pretty gratuitous in a way that I would understand if people disliked. It just kind of comes with the territory, though. Like, Transformers horror for grown-ups is a bit of a silly idea, even when the Bay movies did it. Optimus Prime is so brand ubiquitous to me that putting him in a violent situation kind of feels like that Garfield horror art, or the equivalent of those "what if Mario did drugs" videos. So yeah, I was a bit worried that it might come off as insincere. That said, I didn't think about cutting it because I thought it was pretty gnarly. Well, I think that's all the production stuff I want to talk about for now. Sorry, I'm trying to keep the length at least reasonable. Unless you really want to hear me talk about myself, I don't want to waste too much of your time. Before we get to our last section, let's do a lightning round of questions I couldn't fit anywhere else. Who would you cast to voice each character if you had no limits? This is actually kind of tough because their voices are something kind of abstract to me, and ideally I'd find voice actors who would come up with something original. Megatron would essentially have Frank Welker's, Transformers Prime Megatron voice, but a girl. So deep and rough, not sultry, but more like contemplative. Starscream I've casted as Ella Purnell's Jinx voice from Arcane in the past, but she'd probably be anywhere from a Harley Quinn sort of voice to a Megara from Hercules. I have opened up to the possibility of her having a more gravelly voice. Soundwaves is one I basically have nothing but the intonation for. It's gender irrelevant, but not necessarily androgynous. Like, on the masculine side, it could be something like the Puppet Master from Ghost in the Shell, and on the feminine side, it could be like Daria. Ideally, they just have a very monotonous, flat affect. Lockdown, to me, could honestly have the original Knockout's voice, maybe just a bit rougher and lower. He speaks in a similar cadence, and in a lot of ways he is supposed to be a direct parallel to present Knockout. Knockout himself, on the other hand, I'm not really sure of. He's a lot younger and less confident here, and because of his backstory, he talks a little bit more like an Autobot, I'd say. Honestly, he's just the most regular guy of the whole cast, so there's a lot of different directions you could take him in. He's still very snide, but that's mostly just in asides. There's no way in hell I could have done an accent, but Ravage could have had some sort of blue-collar accent. He is the oldest cast member. He beats out Lockdown by, the Cybertronian equivalent of a few years, and ideally you should feel it. He's, one step below a bit part. Ages ago, I think I had someone recommend Danny DeVito, and that honestly kind of works. It's hard for me to really visualize that in my head, but, if you paired him up to some lines, I think it wouldn't feel wrong. Optimus is whatever. Everyone is a little younger here, even out of the flashback, so maybe not the full-on Peter Cullen everyone's used to, but I probably wouldn't mind, which one did it? Was it Pine? Was Chris Pine the one in the movie? I don't think it was Evans or Pratt, right? Whoever did that voice. Speaking of, I had someone ask, were you inspired by Transformers 1? Not at all, actually. All the planning I did was way before that movie came out, and the only thing it did for me creatively was remind me that I need to finish this faster before people stopped caring about Transformers. Actual writing and world building was all in my head already. Here's another one. How did you keep up the motivation to finish a project like this? And I guess in a similar vein, what inspired you to make this? I'd say probably a lack of impulse control, mostly. There's a point when you realize that you can make something where you stop thinking too hard about whether you should, and if you just keep throwing yourself at it after a while, you've sunk too much time into it to stop. For real though, if you find yourself struggling to commit to larger projects, try coming up with smaller ideas. If it's 20 minutes, try cutting it down to 10. If it's 10, then 5. Not only is it much more attainable, but you'll find that you improve a lot faster when you don't get attached to something just because you've been spending time on it. If something takes less time to make, then you'll learn from the boring, fundamental mistakes quicker, and that process of learning makes you actually want to move on to the next thing, so you can do it better. One question I got a lot is, why did you make some characters girls? Just 'cause. Someone asks, when is the beach episode? Whenever they land on the beach planet, it will happen. Another question, what happened to the Autobots? All I'll tell you for right now is that the Autobots currently have control of Cybertron. The entire reason the Decepticons are in space right now is because they've been driven off and separated, and they're trying to find resources so they can eventually make their way back to Cybertron. In a similar vein, where are the rest of the Decepticons? They are also in space or hiding out on Cybertron. Here's another one. Where is Shockwave? If you followed me for a while, you'll know that Shockwave definitely exists. He's just not here presently. He is very important. That's just a way out from now in the chronology. How does your process change depending on the scene? I think that's what you're asking here. Honestly, it's about the same, I'd say. Since I'm writing the scripts specifically for the boards, I include a lot of screen direction and shot details in the writing itself, so they're quite a bit longer than traditional scripts. I do trend lighter on all the dialogue shots because sometimes depending on how I decide to read a line, the mood will change from my initial plan, and sometimes I just come up with a better idea anyway. For stuff with no dialogue though, I do try to describe everything that happens with more detail. I already discussed a little bit how planning action is different in general, so I hope that answers your question. Would you want to make this official or keep it a fan project? Honestly, I don't know. Sure, I'd love to have a budget for it, and I'd really love to get paid, but honestly, there's a lot of freedom in just having this be a thing I made for fun. From what I've experienced of corporate overhead, I don't know if I'd be willing to let this project go enough to compromise my vision. I know that's a bit silly to say about a Transformer thing, but part of why it's Transformers is that I have a very particular idea, and it's cool enough that I'd make it even if I'm not getting compensated. So honestly, I'm undecided. Now that all that cute stuff is out of the way, let's get to what you guys are actually here for. The number one question I have received since I released the pilot is, when are you making more? The answer is, I don't know. I mentioned that I wasn't expecting this to gain much attention, and I really mean it. I was kind of thinking it would just be a cute little novelty thing for my portfolio, and I would just go about as I usually do, but people have responded really unbelievably well to it. I was not expecting even a fraction of the attention that it got. It's really cool, and I'm extremely humbled, but I also haven't made a single cent off of this because that's not what I was planning for. Some people have gone out of their way to check my print shop and buy something, and I really appreciate that. It's a huge help, but this was like a weekend project for me, you know? I was expecting to finish this eventually and just let it be, and now a bunch of people are wondering when it will continue and asking me if they can volunteer, and it's just like a lot. I think it speaks to how unprepared I was for the scale that I have had multiple people refer to the project as being made by a team, or complimenting all the people who worked on it, and like, besides the music I commissioned, it's just me. It's not especially hard to do, and I'd love to make more. I'm sure if I was working on this full time, it would not take long at all. I just can't do that unless it's going to pay off, you know? Sorry, I know that's a bit of a bummer, but I need to be upfront about that before I talk about anything else. I'll always be making stuff, but going completely indie with a project like this is a big commitment that I really can't make without some serious risk assessment. That said, I am pretty bad at risk assessment, and I am absolutely looking into ways to fund this. It's fun! It's something I can literally do just by myself. I've considered doing something like a Patreon, but right now, I think a Kickstarter or something for an episode is the best idea. Honestly, I feel really weird asking for money, especially right now. I know it's a big thing to rely on you guys for, but a lot of you seem really enthusiastic about this project, and I do want to give you the option for those of you who really want to see it. That's still a little ways away, though. I have some other work obligations to take care of before I try putting that all together. But, you know, stay tuned if I do that. In the meantime, though, if you really want to support me and get some cool stuff in the process, the absolutely best way is my print shop. I have some pilot-themed stuff that's in the works, but for now there's plenty of work featuring my designs and general robot stuff, if you're into that. That's all I got for now. Thank you all again so much for the support. It really means the world. I will catch up with you all very soon with updates. I hope you have a good one. Bye.